My name is Lila, and I'm from Portland, Oregon. Although I've subscribed to your channel for quite a while, I wouldn't exactly say I'm a regular listener. I'm a mom of 2, and I work full-time, so that doesn't leave much time for watching YouTube videos. However, now and then, I'll choose a video of yours to listen to while I'm doing household chores or preparing meals. Last night, I picked your missing 411 video from early this year. Not all of the stories in your videos creep me out. That's not meant as criticism. It's just the truth. But the first story in that video was so unsettling that I had to turn it off entirely. It wasn't because the details were too graphic, and it wasn't because children were getting hurt. I'm especially sensitive to that now. It was because the story triggered a long-buried memory. I realized that many years ago, something eerily similar had happened to me back in high school. During high school, I developed a passion for cross-country running, or XC as we called it. I still love running today. It's therapeutic, and it helped me lose the baby weight after my pregnancies. But back then, I was completely obsessed with it. I wasn't the most athletic person and wasn't great at other sports, but for some reason, I had incredible stamina and could outpace almost any girl in long-distance races. That did 2 things for me. It gave me a huge confidence boost, which led to me diving into the sport even more. It also opened up the possibility of earning an athletic scholarship at a university. My parents, who had always been skeptical about my athletic abilities, suddenly became very supportive of my cross-country passion, especially since I eventually earned a partial scholarship to Oregon State. They considered all those expensive running shoes a solid investment. In my senior year, I focused on my studies, but I was still aiming for that scholarship. I was training 4 days a week, which left me constantly exhausted and grouchy. It was hard to balance running and studying, and I felt like I was failing at both. It wasn't the best time for me, and someone who understood that was Kaya, one of my cross-country teammates. We had a lot in common. We were both shy and nerdy, and while I loved running, Kaya was more focused on securing a scholarship. We got along well, though, and she was a solid teammate. Listening to that missing 411 story reminded me of a race when Kaya acted strangely, right in the middle of the competition. It was early May, and the weather was starting to warm up. We were running a course around the Awai Lakes Trail, located just on the other side of Mount Rainier from Portland. The course was 7 miles long, and we ran in stages with water breaks every couple of miles. The idea was to push ourselves to the limit, take a quick water break, then push forward again. Some of the more competitive runners considered skipping a water station or 2 to improve their times. One key thing to note about the course: there were race marshals with radios who stayed with us in case we got lost or there was a medical emergency. But the marshals tended to stay away from the water stations, especially the male ones during women's races. If you run cross-country in the heat, you need to stay hydrated, and that often means lots of bathroom breaks. So the marshals were always around, but not constantly. We would run in teams or pairs, and our times were compared with other schools. Now, to the race itself, Kaya and I lined up at the start, and when the race began, we skipped the first water station, which was common. At the second station, we took a quick water break and then charged toward the third. By the time we reached the third station, I felt like I might pass out, and Kaya didn't look much better. We were both exhausted, so I wasn't sure I'd be able to keep going at the same pace. I remember Kaya walking back and forth with her water bottle, stretching to stay limber. But then, something unusual happened. She stopped in her tracks. At first, I didn't think much of it, but when I suggested that we keep going, she didn't respond. I repeated myself, and still no reply. I was about to say something else when she suddenly turned, walked toward a tree, and set her water bottle down. Then she kicked off her running shoes and started undressing. I was angry at first. This was a big race, one of the most important ones in our lives, and I thought she was messing around. But when she took off her underwear and socks, I stopped feeling angry and became deeply worried. I asked her if she was okay, but she just kept going, completely ignoring me. When she was fully undressed and standing still, I asked again, "Kaya, what's wrong with you?" She responded in a strangely calm voice, saying, "I'm fine, Lila. I'm just going for a walk." That's when it hit me. Kaya was likely suffering from heat stroke or some kind of delirium. It wasn't something I'd ever seen before, but it seemed to make sense. I wasn't sure what to do, but I remembered seeing something on TV about using water to snap someone out of a stupor. So I poured my water bottle over her head. It didn't help. Kaya barely flinched, and without a word, she turned and began walking into the trees. I started to panic. I shouted, "Kaya, what are you doing?" As I tried to pull her back toward the trail, one of the marshals showed up and saw what was happening. He let out a sigh, turned around, and walked off. I called after him, but he just said he'd go get help. I felt abandoned and scared that I held onto Kaya's wrist, pulling her back as best I could, but I was terrified. After struggling with her for a while, I finally started yelling, "Kaya, please just stop." In that moment, it was as though something shifted in her. She became confused, asked where she was and where her clothes were, and then broke down sobbing. It was terrifying, but it was a relief, too, to see her come back to reality. I led her back to the trail, and fortunately, she didn't run off again. A few minutes later, a medical team arrived, and they took care of Kaya. She was devastated when she realized we were disqualified, but thankfully, everyone was more concerned with her well-being. We got to run the race again, and we ended up in third place in the state. The diagnosis was heat stroke. Kaya recovered, but it was a few weeks before she was fully back to normal. No one was particularly worried, and they said people often act strangely when they're overheated. Kaya and I went to different colleges, and we lost touch over time. I looked her up on Facebook a few years later, but we never really reconnected. Recently, I listened to your story about Maren Kelly in your Missing 411 video, and I couldn't help but think about what happened with Kaya during that race. After researching Maren's case, I found it odd that her friends said they were sober when she stripped and walked off, but they didn't say she was lucid. Maybe, like Kaya, Maren was in some kind of fugue state. Kaya never remembered undressing, and it was like someone else had taken control for a moment until I snapped her out of it. The similarities between the two cases were disturbing. Both incidents happened in roughly the same area, and while Maren's friends didn't freak out about her behavior, it wasn't exactly normal. Maybe, like Kaya, Maren had overheated and was suffering from some form of delirium. I know people have suggested all sorts of theories, but I can't shake the feeling that something about that area might cause people to act strangely. I guess I'll never fully understand what happened with Kaya or Maren, but I hope we one day get answers about Maren, and that her family finds the closure they deserve. In the meantime, I can't stop thinking about how easily something like that could have happened to Kaya if I hadn't stopped her. What if she had disappeared like Maren did? It's a question that haunts me. The feeling it gave me is something I never want to experience again. When I lived in the woods, I used to be really into trail running, and I often ran along a trail that followed a river near a large forest. This trail was said to be very old, one that local Native Americans had used long before settlers arrived. So, I wasn't too surprised one day when I spotted a man with a metal detector just off the trail near a farmer's field. I was curious and stopped to talk to him, asking if he had found anything interesting. At first, he seemed like a friendly guy. He told me he had found an old brown bottle with dimes from the 1920s inside. Then, he asked if I wanted to see something else he had discovered. I wasn't sure, but since it was on my route and I needed a break, I decided to go along. He didn't seem dangerous, just an eccentric older man with a metal detector. We walked down a small path through some trees that led to the river, next to the farmer's field. In the middle of the clearing, there was a large pile of animal skulls, stacked up to about knee height. They looked like deer or cows, maybe even horses. There were smaller skulls too, possibly a raccoon or a skunk. I asked him why they were there, and he said he had been stacking them there for years, ever since he was a kid. I was curious how he had come across so many skulls. He told me that sometimes he and his father would find the heads of animals just lying around on their land, but never the bodies. Only the heads, nothing else. It was definitely unsettling, and I asked if he thought a cougar or bear could be attacking the animals and taking their bodies away. But he said no, he and his father had only ever found heads, never the rest of the animals, no bodies or bones. I let out a nervous laugh, thinking he was just messing with me. But he wasn't joking. He was deadly serious. He went on to say, with a straight face, that he had seen headless animals walking around at night, all moving in the same direction. Now I was really creeped out, but in an entertained way, like I could appreciate how well he was telling this creepy story. However, when he saw I wasn't fully buying it, his expression changed. He stared at me like I had offended him. "You don't believe me, do you?" he asked. "You think I'm crazy?" I quickly backtracked, saying I wasn't implying anything of the sort, but that didn't seem to reassure him, so I decided it was best to leave. I thanked him for talking and started to jog off, but he just stood there, still staring at me with a look that said, "You think I'm dumb, don't you?" As I continued along the trail, I thought about the skulls. They didn't scare me, but the man's story stuck with me. He didn't seem to be telling a tall tale. He believed what he was saying, and that made me wonder, what was more frightening? The thought that his story might actually be true, or the fact that he was so convinced of it. It just makes me realize that while we scare ourselves with ghost stories and tales of headless animals, it's the humans you really have to watch out for. The areas surrounding the renowned Appalachian Mountains are filled with intriguing, often mysterious myths and legends. Some of these, like the Mothman, whose red eyes are said to foretell disaster, or the Flatwoods Monster, believed to be linked to alien encounters, are widely known. However, fewer people are aware of another Appalachian tale that, after some research, may be rooted in an unsettling truth. In parts of southern and eastern Appalachia, locals still speak of a strange, nocturnal race of small humanoids called the moon-eyed people. These moon-eyed people are described as about 4 feet tall, with pale, ghostly skin and large, slightly bulging eyes. They are generally harmless and only come out at night due to their fear of humans. However, if you walk the trails when the moon is full and bright, you might just see one of these beings, bathed in silvery light. To many, the moon-eyed people are just a quaint folktale, but like many so-called myths, there could be more truth to them than one might think. Before the forced relocation of Native American tribes in 1838, North Georgia and other parts of the Appalachian region were still part of the Cherokee Nation. In 1782, the region's governor, a man named John Sevier, visited the Cherokee Chief Okota at Fort Mountain. Chief Okota, who was 90 years old at the time, shared the history of his people with Sevier. During their conversation, Sevier learned about the origins of the Cherokee people and how they had arrived in Appalachia from the northern Great Lakes region. Chief Okota recounted that his ancestors had encountered another group already living there, people so advanced that they turned the mountain into a fortified stronghold, which is why it was named Fort Mountain. The Cherokee fought to drive out this ancient people and eventually succeeded, settling the land themselves. Sevier was intrigued and asked Chief Okota about these people. The chief shocked him by revealing that the previous inhabitants of the area were, in fact, white men from across the Great Sea. These moon-eyed people, as they were known, were described as having enormous, disc-like eyes, much larger than any humans, and they became skilled nocturnal hunters with such keen night vision that it struck fear into the Cherokee. The chief claimed that these beings were so formidable that the Cherokee avoided venturing outside after dark. Governor Sevier, skeptical of the story, believed these people were just part of local legend. However, Chief Okota insisted his account was not a myth. Sevier promised to return the following spring, accompanied by a historian, to officially document the chief's tale. Unfortunately, when Sevier returned in 1783, he learned that the elderly chief had passed away. Despite the death of Chief Okota, the stories of the moon-eyed people persisted. Almost every group of Appalachian Cherokee was familiar with these legends, which even caught the attention of a prominent figure named Benjamin Smith Barton. Born in 1766 in Pennsylvania, Dr. Barton was a respected physician and botanist who had studied at various prestigious universities in Europe. In the late 18th century, he turned his focus to anthropology and the origins of the Native American tribes. In 1797, Barton published a book titled New Views of the Origin of the Tribes and Nations of America, which included an account from Colonel Leonard Marbury, an Army officer fluent in Cherokee. Marbury acted as an intermediary between the government and the native tribes for nearly 2 decades. In his interview with Barton, Marbury explained that the Cherokee people had encountered the moon-eyed people when they first arrived in Appalachia. These strange beings, he said, could not see during the day and were driven out after a short but violent war. At first, Dr. Barton theorized that the moon-eyed people might have been a group of French settlers who were mistaken for something more otherworldly. Some Cherokee described their weapons as unfamiliar or alien, but when Barton interviewed another source, it was revealed that these alien weapons were actually common European tools like hoes, axes, and guns. However, when South Carolina historian B.R. Carroll interviewed merchant explorer James Adair, he rejected the idea that the moon-eyed people were European settlers. Born in 1709 in County Antrim, Ireland, Adair had spent many years living among Native American tribes, particularly the Chickasaw and the Eastern Choctaw. He was highly regarded for his knowledge of Native American cultures. When asked about the moon-eyed people, Adair confirmed that nearly every Appalachian tribe had stories about a race of pale, stunted humanoids. What stood out to Adair was the consistency with which these stories were told. Every tribe spoke of these creatures as being nocturnal, incredibly pale, and deformed. Most tribes also believed the moon-eyed people lived underground, which might explain their unusual appearance. This idea is consistent with a scientific discovery made in 2003 when a team of archaeologists uncovered a small human skull in a cave on the Indonesian island of Flores. Initially thought to be the remains of a child, further analysis revealed that it belonged to a full-grown adult from a previously unknown species of human, Homo floresiensis, also called the Hobbit. This small species of human lived on Flores until about 50,000 years ago. If the Cherokee did indeed arrive in Appalachia around 12,000 years ago, just as the last of the Hobbit people were dying out, it seems plausible that they may have encountered a prehistoric, subhuman race of cave dwellers. It's possible that these creatures were hunted to extinction, but the Cherokee may have been wrong in assuming that every last one of them perished. Perhaps some of them took refuge in deep underground caves and remained hidden from the world, growing even more cautious after the arrival of European settlers. Could the stories of pale, ethereal beings wandering the Appalachian trails be based on real encounters with these ancient beings? The discovery of Homo floresiensis suggests that there are still many secrets about humanity's ancient past that have yet to be revealed. My grandfather grew up in a small town called Vinefield, located in the heart of Virginia. These days, Vinefield consists of just 4 roads and a creek that runs through it, but in the past, it was much bigger. If you walked about a mile out of town, passing a couple of old logging patches, you'd reach the Appalachian Trail, which felt like it was right at your doorstep. Growing up, I thought living in a place like that would offer an idyllic childhood. Small-town values, a close-knit community, and the vast green forest as your backyard. But there was a reason my grandfather left as soon as he could. They always said it was because of the Great Depression, and that might have had some truth to it. But if some of the stories Grandpa later shared were anything to go by, it wasn't just financial troubles that made him want to leave. Although Vinefield, Virginia, seemed quiet and uneventful, the town had a dark history, and some folks still say it's cursed. Before the Civil War, Vinefield was a thriving town where most people worked for one of two plantation families. These two families lived on opposite sides of the holler. One was a group of slave owners employing white townsfolk as drivers, overseers, tradesmen, and clerks, while the other family were staunch abolitionists who also employed white townsfolk, though their farmhands and laborers were typically people of color. This arrangement worked out fine for a while, but as tensions in Kansas grew, things started to escalate. The topic of slavery could no longer be debated calmly, and by the time the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter, the people of Vinefield weren't arguing with words anymore. They were fighting with guns. The abolitionists had the moral high ground, but Virginia was a slave state, and the profits of the slaveholding family were far greater than those of the abolitionists, who paid their workers fairly. The slave owners had money, and they used it to hire mercenaries to protect them from the abolitionists. This protection often came in the form of violence, intimidation, and even murder. Some abolitionists tried to resist, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Most ended up swinging from the rafters, and those with sense fled to the northern states. For the slave owners, things seemed to be going well until the Union arrived. When the Federals marched into town, the plantation owners had to negotiate their way back into control. They managed to keep the plantation, but now they couldn't rely on free labor. There were no abolitionist farmers left to help maintain the estate, and although they brought in people from outside the area to fill in the gaps, it was never the same. The head of the slaveholding family had been cruel but effective, but his son, who took over after the war, was a fool, a tyrant, and a drunk. He might not have owned slaves anymore, but he treated his workers like they were still his property. Worse yet, he mistreated their families and their homes as well. The new plantation owner also had a bad reputation for being too familiar with the town's women. One night, after a woman returned home, claiming the plantation owner had assaulted her, the townspeople had enough. A mob marched to the plantation house, but instead of dragging the owner out and hanging him, they began nailing shut the doors and windows. Anyone who tried to escape was shot. There were plenty of people in the house, not just the owner and his family, but maids, cooks, and nannies who learned quickly to stay away from the windows. Once the house was locked down, the mob set it on fire. They were drunk, cheering as the flames rose. But that all changed when they heard the screams of the women and children trapped inside. It wasn't until then that they realized the horror of what they had done. One man tried to pry the nails from a window frame in a desperate attempt to rescue some of the women and children, but it was too late. They couldn't leave any witnesses. The fire had to look like an accident, both for their consciences and for appearances. The authorities never charged anyone for burning down the plantation house, and for a time it seemed like nothing would come of it. But over the years, whispers about the fire began to spread. Someone somewhere had talked, and the truth started to seep out. A dark cloud settled over Vinefield, one that never quite left. The town's economy collapsed, and fear became a constant presence. It took decades for things to improve, but even after recovery began, people continued to speak of a curse over the town. My grandfather grew up in Vinefield, a town haunted by its own past. It wasn't the peaceful, idyllic childhood I once imagined. Grandpa spoke often about his hometown, perhaps hoping to teach us some gratitude. And it worked. While his childhood stories were mostly funny, there was one that stuck with me, a story that I'll never forget. It all started in 1934, when a hunter named Thomas Walker came back to town after spending hours in his hunting blind. This was just after Prohibition ended, and a little speakeasy had opened up on Pine Lane. Thomas walked in, drank a bottle of beer, followed by a shot of whiskey, then ordered another round. The other patrons were curious about the occasion, but Thomas was too shaken to share good news. In fact, he was more terrified than he had ever been. He'd been sitting in his blind when a massive buck walked into view. But before he could take his shot, the deer bolted off into the woods. As Thomas lowered his rifle, he saw something else. A fast-moving creature, too big to be a dog, too small to be a bear. It darted through the trees, and Thomas was terrified. He stayed in his blind, clenching his rifle, for a few minutes before quickly retreating to his truck and driving back to town as fast as he could. He claimed the creature was stalking him, staying just out of sight but never far behind. When he told the other men at the speakeasy, they dismissed his story, attributing it to a coyote or a bear. But Thomas insisted it was something different, something fast, intelligent, and unlike anything he had ever seen. A week later, the town was buzzing with talk about what Thomas had seen. While some thought it was just another tall tale, others were starting to believe him. By the time my grandfather was a boy, the old plantation house, the one burned down by the mob, had been abandoned for decades. No one wanted to buy it, not even the carpetbaggers from up north. The land was wild and overgrown, with only the remnants of the house left behind. The kids in town, though, were drawn to it. Despite warnings, they sneaked up to explore the grounds, and one day, a young girl and her sister went there with their dog. Within minutes, the dog started growling and tucked its tail. Then, the older girl saw something moving in the trees, a creature she described as a monster. She ran with her sister, but the creature followed them, running on all fours before standing up on two legs to watch them. The two girls made it back to town, terrified, and the older one described the creature as huge, with shaggy hair and a deformed face. People thought it was just a hungry bear, but they couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister was out there. The best hunter in town, James Robinson, volunteered to go into the woods and hunt the beast. A few days later, his dog returned alone, and the townspeople assumed James had gotten lost. But he never came back. A group of men went into the woods, armed and determined to find him. They set a trap with fresh meat and waited. When one man went to check the bait, the creature attacked. After a brutal struggle, the men shot the creature dead. They found it wasn't a bear at all, but a man, covered in dirt, with long hair, claws, and burned scars all over his body. The town doctor, who had been treating people in Vinefield for years, identified the creature as the son of the plantation owner who had survived the fire. Turned out that, decades earlier, the boy had escaped the burning house. The mob had left him for dead, but he survived, living in the woods like an animal. No one knew exactly how he had become what he was, but it was clear that the boy had never truly survived the fire that night. Killing him was the final chapter in a murder that had started 30 years earlier. This is why the people of Vinefield believe the town is cursed, not because of some ghost, but because the bloodshed from the past continues to haunt the present. A few years ago, I went hiking the Appalachian Trail with some friends, and we decided to camp at a site that had comfort stations. One night, I woke up around 2 a.m., needing to use the bathroom. The site we were at was a corner spot, so there was a short trail at the back that led through the woods to the washroom. I could have walked around the front, but I decided to take the shortcut through the woods like I usually did to save time since I was tired and really needed to pee. As I walked down the middle of the trail, I heard a faint sound from my right, almost like laughing. I didn't get scared. I knew raccoons and porcupines sometimes make these noises at night. I didn't see anything like that, but since it was dark, I didn't think too much of it and kept walking toward the comfort station. Then, just a few seconds later, I heard a voice from deep in the woods, a woman's voice asking, "Hello." To say I jumped would be an understatement, but I was just startled, not scared. I didn't know whether she was talking to me or someone else, so I ended up saying, "Hey," in a friendly voice. I didn't want her to think I was some weirdo if she was already freaked out by hearing footsteps at night. But after I said, "Hey," there was no response, and that's when I started to get a little uneasy. Once I reached the comfort station, I took care of business and managed to calm myself down. I don't believe in ghosts, and I still don't. Even though the timing and sudden silence were a bit creepy, I figured it was probably just another person, just as spooked as I was. I started heading back the same way I had come, telling myself that if I heard anything again, I would just run back to my tent. The further I walked, the quieter it got, and I was about 75% of the way back down the trail when I thought, I hope I didn't scare that girl too much. That's when I heard her voice again. But this time, it wasn't exactly the same voice. It sounded like her voice, but different in a way that made my skin crawl. It said, "Come back." That was the moment I ran faster than I've ever run in my life. I sprinted like an athlete and threw myself back into my tent so quickly that I woke everyone up. They kept asking me what was wrong, and all I could say was, I think I just freaked myself out. There was no way they'd believe me if I told them what I heard. They'd probably think I was drunk, high, or just a little scared. They definitely wouldn't believe that the voice I heard changed like that. It might sound crazy, but I kind of hoped they would hear it too. The next day, we moved campsites, and I didn't hear anything like that again for the rest of the trip. I'm honestly glad that was the case, but I can't help but wonder what I really heard that night. That question still keeps me up at night. Although this might not be the typical type of scary story, it was definitely the most unsettling and eerie thing that has ever happened to me, and I think some of your viewers might enjoy it. I used to do a lot of trail running near the big river in northern Wisconsin. Some of my favorite routes went right through the Grand Pine Forest, and there were also great spots for fishing and swimming nearby. I would load up my old truck, drive a few miles up the river, and then run a big loop that would take me back to my truck, feeling like I'd burned off a lot of sweat and maybe a few pounds along the way. Both sides of the trail were lined with tall white and red pines, with the occasional birch and other trees mixed in. It was scenic, beautiful, but it sure could get hot in the middle of a July afternoon. Some days, I would have rather been floating down the river than sweating it out on the trail. Certain sections of the trail were fairly close to nearby roads, so you could sometimes hear the faint sound of a car or truck radio or music playing. But then, one day in early July, I heard something strange that sounded like classic rock music coming from deep in the trees. I usually ran without headphones when I was on the trail because it was important to stay aware of my surroundings. As I kept running, the music seemed to get louder and closer, as if I was about to run into an ATV or a group of off-road bikers. Within just 30 seconds, it felt like the sound went from being far off to right next to me, and it should have been obvious where it was coming from. Yet, despite how loud it was, I couldn't see the source. It had to be within 30 feet of me, just off to the left in the woods, but nothing was visible. The sound shifted, growing louder 1 second, then turning into a strange buzzing noise, like the sound of tiny wings. That's when I saw it. It was about 5 feet away from me, and the moment my eyes locked onto it, I could tell it was some sort of large, shapeless shadow moving through the trees. The cloud of buzzing flies appeared like one single entity, thousands of them swarming together in unison. Their buzzing was different pitches of the same note, definitely not classic rock, but still strangely hypnotic. Then, without warning, the cloud of flies darted toward me. I tried to back away, but it moved so fast. Before I could turn around and run, I felt the cloud of insects envelop me. I expected to feel bites or stings, and I started screaming and flailing my arms in a frantic attempt to keep them off. I could hear and feel the buzzing in my ears, and even though the wings of the flies were tiny, the collective sound was almost deafening as they surrounded me. For a moment, it felt like an eternity, but just as suddenly, the buzzing faded, and the cloud of flies moved on. When I opened my eyes, I caught one last glimpse of it before it disappeared into the trees. As the sound of the buzzing faded completely, it was replaced by the faint sound of music, almost like AC/DC playing from a tiny speaker in the distance. It was the most unsettling and chilling experience I'd ever had. It almost felt like some kind of supernatural manifestation, something that could have scared an ancestor of mine to death if they had encountered it centuries ago. It was as close to a ghost or spirit as I've ever come, just this mysterious presence that first made itself known by its strange sound before it became visible. When I got home, I did some research online to try and figure out what exactly I had experienced. This was back in 2001, when the internet didn't have nearly as much information as it does today. But I still managed to find a few sites that gave me some answers. Apparently, just a few months earlier, Grand Traverse County had discovered a major infestation of tent caterpillars. These caterpillars create webs that look like tents, and they strip the leaves off trees, causing environmental damage. The officials in Traverse City had consulted with experts who suggested introducing black flies that lay their eggs on the caterpillars' cocoons. This would help reduce the infestation and restore balance to the ecosystem. Believe it or not, there are companies that specialize in breeding insects like black flies for these kinds of ecological purposes. They sold a large number of flies to Traverse City, and because these flies had been living in close spaces for their short lives, some of them stayed in formation longer than others. That must have been what I saw in the woods that day. A strange, unnerving sight caused by the black flies that had been released to help with the infestation. It was a relief to finally understand what had happened, even though the experience still left me shaken. Knowing that it wasn't something supernatural gave me peace of mind, but it didn't make the experience any less creepy. It's funny how things can be so disturbing, even when there's a perfectly logical explanation behind them. I have no desire to ever go through anything like that again. Feeling that swarm of buzzing black flies surrounding me was one of the most terrifying things I've ever experienced. Around 10 years ago, an old college buddy and I decided to hike the eastern Tennessee part of the Appalachian Trail. We weren't too serious about it. We took our time, stopping at grocery stores and diners to grab some snacks and little comforts along the way. At one point, we stopped in a town in Hancock County to grab a few six-packs and maybe a bottle of whiskey, since we were in his home state. Anyone from around there would laugh because we didn't know the one thing that everyone else did. There wasn't a single drop of alcohol for sale in the entire county. We ended up in a dry town, so while we could stock up on snacks, there was no booze. While we were at the store, the woman behind the counter told us if we wanted alcohol, we'd have to walk to the next county. But if we asked around, maybe someone could get us some. We asked a few people, but while everyone was friendly, no one could help us. We were about to give up when we saw a guy leaving the store and heading toward his truck. He looked about our age, maybe 25 to 30, and seemed like someone who might enjoy a drink, so we decided to ask if he could give us a ride to the next county and we'd buy him a few beers as thanks. He seemed friendly but wasn't too keen on giving us a ride until we mentioned the beers. After that, he invited us into his truck, and we set off toward the nearest liquor store, making small talk about the hike. When we asked how long the ride would take, he said about an hour there and back. If we wanted to continue hiking where we had left off, we'd lose all daylight, and finding a place to camp would be a hassle. He seemed to think for a moment before telling us he knew another place where we could get booze. The catch was that it wasn't exactly legal, seeing as it was still a dry county. He asked if we were cops, and we laughed and said no, so he offered us moonshine instead of just beer. At this point, I should explain why we got so excited when he mentioned moonshine. Moonshine is homemade liquor, and we talked about it a lot before we even started the hike. Getting our hands on some real local moonshine seemed like the coolest thing ever. It's like when you're in the Caribbean and you want to try the local rum, or when you're in Germany for Oktoberfest, you want the real beer. So, When this guy said he would take us to his buddy's place to buy some moonshine, we didn't hesitate. He changed course a bit, and we thought we were headed to a house where we'd give him some cash, and he'd grab the moonshine for us. But when we arrived at the place, it didn't look like anyone's house. It actually looked like some kind of community building, much bigger than most of the homes in the area. What really gave it away were the motorcycles outside. My younger brother was a big fan of Sons of Anarchy at the time, so I immediately recognized what we were looking at. We were at a motorcycle club's clubhouse. It was pretty cool to see a real clubhouse in person, but we still thought we were just picking up moonshine. When we walked inside, the place was decorated with the club's logo and memorabilia. Everything seemed pretty normal until we noticed how the bikers inside reacted. The second we walked in, everyone stopped what they were doing and stared at us. Our new friend asked if the president of the club was around, and when he was told the president was in his office, our new buddy told us to take a seat at the bar. No one served us drinks, though. Instead, the bikers kept glaring at us as if we weren't welcome. Our friend disappeared down the hall, and we sat there feeling more and more uncomfortable. No one said anything, but I tried explaining to one of the bikers that our friend had said it was fine for us to be there. He didn't say anything back. He just stared at me and gripped a pool cue like he was imagining it was my neck. Just as we were about to leave, we heard shouting from down the hall, followed by crashing sounds. Our friend came flying out of the hallway with a huge, angry biker chasing him, yelling about how he was going to get them caught. We quickly got off our stools and tried to head toward the door, but another biker stepped in our way and told us we weren't going anywhere. At that point, I realized that our new friend must have walked into the president's office and told them we were there to buy moonshine, and the president had lost it. We knew it had been a risky move to just walk in and ask, but we figured our new friend knew enough people to make it work. Apparently, we were wrong. The president wasn't happy, and now we were caught in the middle of it. One of the bikers blocking the door let us through, but I stopped and asked what was going to happen to our friend. The president pointed to the door and told us to get out. I remember feeling relieved, thinking he was just going to let us go. But at the same time, I didn't want to just walk out and leave our friend behind. Every part of me wanted to run and leave, but another part of me knew it would make us look like scumbags if we just abandoned him after he tried to help us. I asked the president what was going to happen to him, and he snapped that our friend wasn't actually our friend, but had been trying to rob us. I couldn't believe it at first, but looking back, it made sense. The bikers hadn't cared about us buying moonshine. They cared about the heat it would bring down on them. We quickly realized our so-called friend was just using us, and that's when we decided to get out as fast as possible. The president had told us to leave, and we didn't need to be told twice. I prefer not to share my name, but I'm a 37-year-old woman from the UK, living in Surrey. I've been a fan of your channel for a while, especially your hiking and camping stories. I know many of your videos focus on outdoor themes like forests and national parks. Well, I've got my own story to share, the story of how I developed xylophobia. For those unfamiliar with the term, xylophobia is the fear of forests and woodlands. More specifically, it's an irrational fear of these natural spaces. Interestingly, the word xyo comes from Greek, meaning wood. Initially, xylophobia was used to describe a fear of wooden objects, but over time, it evolved into describing a fear of forests and woodlands. So, for those wondering, it's not the fear of xylophones, as a friend once joked, though I do like xylophones. So, how did I develop this overwhelming fear? Well, that's an interesting story. For the past year or so, I've been attending therapy with a highly regarded cognitive behavioral psychologist. Some people might say CBT is just a fancy name for talk therapy, and they're not wrong. However, CBT goes beyond talking. It involves writing, recording audio, even sketching or painting. Anything that helps you confront and work through your feelings and thoughts. It's widely used for treating substance abuse, anger management, anxiety, depression, grief, and, as in my case, post-traumatic stress disorder and phobias. At first, my therapist and I focused mainly on face-to-face sessions, helping her understand my issues. But after a while, she suggested I take on a writing project. The idea was to explore and describe the root of my trauma, including how it made me feel and think. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but once I had the idea, it hit me that I could share the story with others. I could send it to your submissions, and maybe one day I'd hear it narrated on your channel. As it turns out, writing this story was part of my healing process. If I could share it, it would give me a sense of control over something that used to control me. Plus, if someone else benefits from it, emotionally or physically, then it's worth the effort. Now, to get to the point, this is how it happened. I was living with my parents in a small village in Surrey, close to Guildford. Back then, there weren't any gyms, so unless you wanted to run in circles on a school field, you'd head out to the nearby woodland trails. That's how I got into trail running, to burn off the stress of my job. I hated cardio at first, but there was something about running through the woods that made me feel more centered and productive than anything else. I became addicted to it. I ran the same routes at the same times on the same days, no matter the weather. If I didn't get my run in, I'd have trouble sleeping. Even when it was dark, I'd wear a headlamp and keep running. I knew the trails so well that I could run them with my eyes closed. The woods didn't scare me. In the UK, we didn't have the big wildlife you'd find in America. No bears or snakes. Maybe a badger now and then, but they were harmless. I liked badgers. For over a year, I ran these trails several times a week, always at the same times. The only thing that concerned my mom was that I'd be out alone. She would always warn me to watch out for anyone acting suspiciously. I'd picture some creepy person lurking in the dark, but it was all just paranoia, or so I thought. One Sunday, I was planning to go for a run before dinner. My mom was making a roast, and I needed to get at least 4 miles in to work off the food. After lunch, I headed out across the fields toward the woods. I jogged past the stables, through the old polo fields and into the forest. After about half a mile, I saw a man walking toward me on the trail. He was a big guy, dressed in a dark green jacket, light blue jeans, and hiking boots. I'd passed plenty of hikers before, so I didn't think much of it. But as we got closer and made eye contact, I gave a polite afternoon, only to be shocked when he suddenly lunged at me, shoving me off balance. I crashed to the ground hard. I was dazed, but as I scrambled to my feet, I reached for my headphones and asked him, "What the hell is wrong with you?" He didn't answer. Then, before I could react, he threw a punch that hit me square in the face. The blow knocked me back, and I think I hit my head on a tree as I fell. I tried to get up, but before I could, he grabbed me by the neck and started dragging me along the trail. I screamed, but he shoved his hand over my mouth. I bit his finger, and he yelled in pain, giving me a brief moment of satisfaction. But then his fist hit my cheek again, knocking me to the ground. This time I played dead, hoping he'd think I was out cold. I know it sounds silly, but I was trying to buy myself some time, hoping for a chance to escape. For a moment, he seemed to believe I was unconscious. Then, after kicking me and slapping me a few more times, I started to fake being suffocated, gasping for air. He seemed to think he'd done something wrong and was panicking. To my surprise, he backed off and started pacing, swearing under his breath. Then, I heard him pick up a large rock, something heavy enough to crush me if he dropped it on my head. As he struggled with the rock, I seized the chance. I jumped to my feet and ran as fast as I could, feeling my legs ache and my lungs burning. I had to keep going. I didn't look back, terrified I might run into a tree and knock myself out. I ran for what felt like forever, my heart racing in my chest. The pain in my legs was unbearable, but I couldn't stop, couldn't let him catch me. When I finally slowed down and looked around, there was no sign of him. I don't think he could keep up with me, and I was lucky to escape. I made it home safely, called the police, and gave a statement. They were wonderful and did everything they could to catch my attacker, but nothing came of it. The worst part wasn't the injuries or the fear. It was that he was never caught. The fear of running into him again, even though I know the chances are small, is still there. It haunts me. I don't live near that area anymore, but a part of me still wonders if I'll encounter him again one day. I hope that one day I'll be able to feel the same excitement about the woods as I used to. And if sharing this story helps even one person, then it was worth facing my fears. No matter what happens, we always have the power to fight back. I want to share a story about a young woman from the Appalachian Mountains named Willa Mae Harris, known around here as the girl who married a dead man. Willa Mae lived in a town called Pine Ridge in eastern Kentucky with her husband. They were a young couple, married at 17, in a rushed ceremony when Willa Mae found out she was expecting. They moved into a modest house, and for a short while they were happy. Sadly, halfway through the pregnancy, Willa Mae lost the baby. The loss devastated them both, but her husband, George, never forgave her for it. He blamed her for not taking care of herself, accusing her of not loving him anymore. Unable to cope with the grief, George turned to drinking, and when he drank, he became abusive. Eventually, the only time Willa Mae found peace was when George worked as an oil rig worker in Texas, which meant he was gone for 2 weeks at a time. This gave her 2 weeks of calm, followed by 2 weeks of torment when he returned. While George was away, he asked his brother, Hank Harris, to check in on Willa Mae from time to time. Hank visited once a month to help with the work around the house. Over time, Hank, who was single, noticed how sad Willa Mae seemed and started talking to her. When Willa Mae realized that Hank wasn't spying on her but genuinely cared, she broke down and shared her painful story. She told him about the abuse, how miserable she felt, and how she wished her life could be different. Hank comforted her as best he could, and before long, they had fallen in love. They tried to resist acting on their feelings for a while, but it was hard to ignore their emotions. Eventually, Willa Mae knew she had to leave George. She waited until George went off to Texas again, then spent a few days packing and planning her escape. She wrote him a letter, telling him exactly how she felt, how she never really loved him, how he was cruel, and how she was leaving him for good. After packing her things, she caught a wagon to the nearby town of Clearview, about 15 miles away. There, she met Hank, who had been waiting for her. The only issue was that Hank couldn't get the last of his money until the next day. They agreed to wait until the morning. The next day, Willa Mae went to the train station to meet Hank. But when she saw a figure waiting, it wasn't Hank. It was her husband, George. George had gone to Texas but was sent home early because his job was canceled. He had taken several trains to get back and arrived just hours after Willa Mae. While she had been at the hotel dreaming of a life with Hank, George was reading the letter she had written. George assumed Willa Mae wouldn't expect him back for several days, and in her letter, she told him all about her plans and when she intended to leave. By the time he would have found out, she thought she'd be far away, but George's early return ruined that. After reading her letter, George went to Hank's house, but Hank wasn't there. The only thing he found was Hank's jacket. George then made his way back to the station with Willa Mae, telling her she had to come with him to apologize to his brother. He arranged for her bags to be returned home and forced her to accompany him to Hank's place. When they arrived, Willa Mae tried to escape, but George was too strong. He dragged her to the yard of Hank's house and forced her to look at Hank's lifeless body hanging from the porch. Afterward, George told her that she was the one responsible for what had happened, and then he left, turning himself in to the sheriff. He gave the deputies the location of Hank's body, and since Hank was unmarried and had no family, there was no one to inform. But when the sheriff's men went to collect Hank's body, it had disappeared, and Willa May was nowhere to be found. The next morning, an abandoned cart was found in front of the sheriff's office. When the sheriff's deputy removed the sheet covering the cart, they found Hank's body, perfectly preserved, with a wedding ring on his finger.